I've lived in this house for over 30 years, raised my children here, and watched my grandchildren take their first steps on these floors. So when police cars pulled into my driveway because my daughter-in-law claimed I was unstable, I didn't panic. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply invited the officer inside. For months, I had felt something was wrong: whispers, sudden accusations, subtle attempts to make me look unreliable. I trusted my instincts enough to prepare. When the officer asked if I had anything to add, I nodded and pointed toward the living room. One video, one button. And suddenly, the story she told unraveled in seconds. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about concern. It was about control, and she had underestimated me completely. My name is Lorraine Beckett, and I am 69 years old. After my husband passed, my son insisted I move in with his family. He said it would be easier for everyone, safer for me, better for the children. At first, it felt comforting to be surrounded by familiar voices again. I helped with meals, watched the kids after school, and stayed mostly out of the way. This was still my home, the place I had lived in for decades, but I tried not to remind anyone of that. I didn't want conflict. I believed family meant compromise. Slowly, though, I noticed how decisions were made without me, how conversations stopped when I entered the room. I told myself it was an adjustment. I didn't yet understand that sharing a roof doesn't always mean sharing respect. At first, her tone was polite but distant. Over time, it sharpened. Comments slipped in quietly about how I organized things, how I spoke to the children, how I forgot small details. None of it was overt enough to confront. That was the point. She framed irritation as concern and criticism as help. If I disagreed, she smiled and suggested I was being sensitive. I began questioning myself more than her. Hostility doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness, repeated often enough to feel normal. I noticed how she corrected me in front of the kids, how she sighed when I entered shared spaces. It wasn't an open conflict, it was erosion. And erosion is harder to prove, but just as damaging. The word forgetful appeared more often. She used it casually, like an observation, not an insult. If I misplaced something, she'd raise her eyebrows. If I disagreed with her parenting, she'd say I might be confused. Each remark was small, easy to dismiss. But together they formed a pattern. She repeated these comments in front of my son, always gently, always with a concerned tone. I noticed how he began watching me more closely. Subtle accusations don't aim to convince you, they aim to convince others. I felt myself becoming cautious, second-guessing every action. The shift was unsettling. I hadn't changed, but the way I was being described had. And slowly, that description began to take on a life of its own. Gradually, my routine was interrupted. She suggested I rest instead of joining family outings. She told neighbors I wasn't feeling well when I hadn't said that. Phone calls were missed. Invitations stopped reaching me. Isolation doesn't require locks. It requires control of information. I found myself spending more time alone in my room, not because I wanted to, but because it felt simpler. Less tension, less scrutiny. She framed it as care, quiet time, reduced stress. But isolation wrapped in kindness is still isolation. I felt myself fading from daily life, becoming someone to manage rather than include. The children spent less time with me. Decisions happened elsewhere. I wasn't excluded openly. I was gently removed, her language changed again. Now there were worries. She asked what would happen if I had an episode. She wondered aloud whether the house was safe for the children. These weren't questions meant for answers. They were statements meant to linger. Each one planted doubt. If I objected, she looked offended and said she was only trying to help. Concern became a weapon precisely because it sounded reasonable. Threats don't always sound aggressive. Sometimes they sound like planning. I realized then that this wasn't about misunderstandings. It was about positioning. She wasn't arguing with me, she was preparing a case. And she was doing it slowly enough that no single moment felt urgent, but together they felt dangerous. I trusted my family instinctively, and that trust began to fracture. Not because of one event, but because of accumulation. I noticed how my son hesitated before agreeing with me, how he deferred to her explanations instead of asking mine. Trust doesn't disappear suddenly, it thins. Each time my words were softened or corrected, it weakened. I started documenting conversations in my head, replaying them later, checking for mistakes. That vigilance was exhausting. I wasn't paranoid, I was paying attention. Something fundamental had shifted. I no longer felt secure in my own home. When trust cracks, safety goes with it. And once I felt unsafe, I knew I needed to protect myself, not emotionally, but practically. I didn't announce it. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply installed small cameras in common areas, the same kind families use for security. I told no one. Preparation doesn't require permission. I needed clarity, not confrontation. The cameras weren't about catching someone in a lie, they were about protecting the truth. I continued my routine as normal, careful not to change my behavior. Almost immediately, patterns emerged. Conversations shifted when she thought no one was listening. Instructions to the children changed. Comments about me sounded different when said privately. Watching the footage wasn't satisfying, it was sobering. But it confirmed what my instincts had been warning me about. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a strategy. And now I have proof. The sound of sirens outside the house felt unreal at first. She looked through the window and saw a patrol car slow to a stop in front of the driveway. Her stomach tightened, but her mind stayed clear. Police didn't come without reason, and she already suspected what this was about. The doorbell rang, sharp and official. Inside the house, everything went quiet. The children were ushered away. Curtains shifted as neighbors noticed the commotion. She took a slow breath before opening the door. The officer's posture was neutral, professional, but alert. Whatever story had been told, it had been serious enough to warrant a visit. She understood then that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be laughed off. This was an accusation, and it had been delivered with authority. The words were spoken carefully, but they still landed hard. The officer explained that a call had been made expressing concern about her mental state and the safety of children in the home. The phrasing was polite, but the implication was devastating. She felt the weight of it immediately. Instability isn't something you easily defend against. It casts doubt before you speak. She noticed how the officer observed her reactions closely, evaluating tone, posture, expression. Every movement felt examined. Inside, she felt anger rise, but she didn't show it. This accusation wasn't about a single incident. It was the result of months of quiet framing. Hearing it spoken aloud confirmed what she had feared. Someone had officially questioned her reality and expected others to believe it. Outside, small clusters of neighbors had gathered, pretending not to stare. Whispers moved faster than facts. A police car in front of a family home always draws conclusions. She felt exposed in a way she hadn't before. Reputation can be damaged without a word being spoken. She recognized faces she had waved to for years now watching with uncertainty. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. The scene told its own story. She understood then how effective this tactic was. Even if nothing came of it, doubt had already been planted. Damage wasn't just legal, it was social. And that kind of damage lingers. Standing there, she made a decision. She would not let this end with assumptions hanging in the air. Silence would only confirm the lie. The officer remained professional, but caution colored every word. He explained procedures, asked routine questions, and listened carefully to her responses. His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't relaxed either. He had to consider the possibility that the call was valid. She understood that. Authority requires caution. She answered calmly, clearly, without defensiveness. Panic would only validate suspicion. The officer glanced around the home, noting details, assessing the atmosphere. This wasn't about guilt or innocence yet, it was about evaluation. She could feel the balance tipping based on perception. That awareness sharpened her focus. This moment required control, not emotion. And she was ready. Her daughter-in-law stepped forward at just the right moment, voice soft, expression worried. She spoke about stress, confusion, and fear for the children's safety. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Every concern felt rehearsed. She didn't accuse directly, she implied. Concern is powerful when performed convincingly. She even thanked the officer for coming, reinforcing the image of responsibility. Watching this unfold was chilling. The performance was calm, measured, and strategic. This wasn't a reaction. It was a plan executed on cue. The officer listened, nodding slightly. She realized how dangerous manufactured concern could be. Lies dressed as care are harder to challenge, but she didn't interrupt. She didn't argue, she waited. While the story was being told about her, she stood quietly, hands steady, breathing controlled. She didn't deny or defend immediately. Calm isn't weakness, it's clarity. She knew emotional reactions would only support the narrative being built. Instead, she maintained eye contact with the officer and listened attentively. That calm unsettled the performance unfolding beside her. She could feel it. The contrast mattered. One side relied on implication, the other relied on presence. Remaining calm wasn't instinct, it was discipline. She had prepared for this moment long before the sirens arrived. Panic had no place here. Truth didn't need volume, it needed timing. And she was waiting for exactly the right moment when the officer asked if there was anything she wanted to add. She finally spoke. Her voice was steady, respectful. She didn't argue with the accusation or challenge the concern. Instead, she invited him inside. The simplicity of it shifted the atmosphere instantly. She said there was something he should see. No drama, no explanation, just certainty. The invitation wasn't defensive, it was confident. The officer paused, then nodded. Her daughter-in-law's expression tightened just slightly. That was the first crack. She turned and led the way into the living room, knowing exactly what would happen next. This wasn't about telling her side anymore. It was about showing it, and once shown, it could not be taken back. She walked to the television and reached for the remote without hesitation. Her movements were calm, practiced, as if this moment had been rehearsed many times in her mind. She explained briefly that cameras had been installed for household security, nothing more. The officer nodded, signaling her to continue. The screen lit up, showing a familiar living room from a quiet angle. Time stamps appeared in the corner. Ordinary moments played at first, daily routines, children passing through, nothing alarming. Then the tone shifted. Context began to form. This wasn't a single clip meant to shock, it was a pattern meant to speak. Introducing the footage changed the room's energy instantly. What had been accusation-driven now became evidence-based. Control moved away from words and into facts. As the footage continued, behavior that once seemed harmless took on a new meaning. Conversations were shown starting calmly, then subtly redirected. Questions were framed to provoke confusion. Statements were repeated until they sounded like truth. The manipulation wasn't aggressive, it was methodical. Watching it unfold made the intent undeniable. The officer leaned slightly closer to the screen, attention sharpening. The difference between concern and control became clear in real time. The footage didn't exaggerate or editorialize. It simply recorded what had been said and how often. Seeing manipulation laid out without interruption stripped it of power. What had relied on secrecy now existed openly. The narrative being built against her began to fracture under its own repetition. Specific accusations were replayed side by side with footage that disproved them. Claims of erratic behavior were contradicted by calm, routine interactions. Allegations of forgetfulness were undermined by clear, consistent responses. The contrast was undeniable. The officer paused the video more than once, replaying sections to confirm what he was seeing. Each false claim lost credibility with every timestamp. This wasn't an interpretation, it was a contradiction. The reliability of the caller's story weakened visibly. What had sounded convincing in isolation failed under comparison. Falsehoods depend on context being hidden. Here, context was complete. The more evidence played, the less room there was for doubt. The story told to authorities no longer matched the reality on screen. Audio clips followed, capturing tone and intent that visuals alone couldn't show. The words were calm on the surface but edged with suggestion. Phrases like "maybe you forgot" and "are you sure you remember" repeated frequently. The pattern became unmistakable. Audio removed ambiguity. It revealed strategy. The officer listened without interruption, his expression shifting subtly with each clip. What had been framed as care now sounded calculated. Audio evidence is harder to dismiss because it carries intent. The pauses, emphasis, and repetition told their own story. Hearing it all together removed plausible deniability. The manipulation wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, sustained, and clearly directed. The officer stepped back from the screen and took a moment before speaking. His posture changed, less evaluative and more decisive. He asked clarifying questions, not accusatory ones but procedural. The focus had shifted. He was no longer assessing her stability. He was reassessing the validity of the call. Notes were taken. Times were confirmed. The officer's tone softened toward her and sharpened toward the accusations. Reassessment doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows what questions are asked and which ones are no longer relevant. Authority adjusted to evidence. The footage had done what explanations never could. It reset the situation entirely. The change was immediate. Her daughter-in-law's composure cracked as the officer's attention shifted away from her. She interrupted, attempted to explain, then contradicted herself. The calm concern she had performed earlier dissolved into defensiveness. She questioned the legality of the cameras, then denied statements already recorded. Panic surfaced in rushed words and shifting posture. The more she spoke, the worse it became. Panic doesn't convince, it exposes. The officer asked her to stop speaking more than once. That alone spoke volumes. What had been framed as care now looked like control slipping away. The room felt tense not because of conflict, but because deception had lost its footing. By the end of the footage, there was nothing left to argue. The lies didn't explode, they deflated. Slowly, completely. The officer summarized what he had observed, carefully and clearly. The report he began writing reflected evidence, not accusations. The story that had prompted the police call no longer existed. It had been replaced by documentation pointing elsewhere. She didn't feel relief so much as vindication. Truth hadn't needed emotion or volume, it needed patience. As the television screen went dark, the balance of power in the room had fully shifted. The lies that once threatened her safety no longer held weight, and once collapsed, they could not be rebuilt. The officer began documenting everything carefully, replaying key sections of the footage and noting timestamps. What had started as a welfare check transformed into an evidence-based report. He asked precise questions, not to accuse but to verify. She answered calmly, understanding the importance of accuracy. The process was methodical, almost quiet, but its impact was heavy. Documentation turned truth into record, something that couldn't be reinterpreted later. The officer explained that false reports carry consequences, especially when children are involved. Writing continued page after page. This wasn't a resolution yet, but it was a foundation. Once evidence is documented, it lives beyond the moment. And this record would speak long after the door closed. Because children had been named in the call, protocol required further action. Child Protective Services were notified, not as punishment, but as procedure. The distinction mattered. The officer explained that CPS would review the situation to ensure the children's safety and assess the accuracy of the original claims. The room grew tense. The accusation that once targeted her now redirected itself toward the source. She felt no satisfaction, only steadiness. Systems exist to evaluate truth impartially, and now those systems are engaged. CPS involvement changed the stakes. Performative concern would be scrutinized. Statements would be verified. Oversight had arrived, and it wouldn't rely on impressions or emotion. Her son stood silently through most of it, eyes moving between the officer, the footage, and his wife. When the reality settled, he finally spoke, not defensively but quietly. Questions he should have asked months ago surfaced all at once. He replayed conversations in his head, recognizing patterns he had ignored. Trust cracked, then broke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply asked for honesty and didn't receive it. That absence said everything. Confronting the truth is rarely loud. It's heavy. Watching him process it was painful but necessary. Denial had protected nothing. Now clarity, however uncomfortable, was the only path forward. With authorities involved and evidence documented, her daughter-in-law's story lost coherence. Details shifted. Explanations changed. Concern turned into defensiveness. The calm narrative she had crafted couldn't survive scrutiny. Each attempt to regain control only exposed more inconsistencies. She blamed stress, misunderstanding, fear, but none aligned with the footage. The unraveling wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. Lies don't collapse all at once, they fray until nothing holds. The more she spoke, the less credible she became. Watching it happen felt surreal. Months of manipulation dissolved in minutes, not because of confrontation, but because truth had been preserved patiently. The shift in authority was unmistakable. Questions were no longer directed at her. They were directed elsewhere. The officer's tone adjusted accordingly, firmer, more direct. Authority follows evidence, not volume. She felt the pressure lift slightly, replaced by something steadier, recognition. She wasn't being evaluated anymore. She was being protected. That shift changed the room's energy. Control no longer belonged to the person who spoke the loudest or appeared the most concerned. It belonged to the facts. Authority had moved, and it would not move back. The realization settled in quietly, powerful, and irreversible. Amid the fallout, ownership of the home was clarified formally. Documents were reviewed, records checked, and facts confirmed. The house was legally hers. This wasn't new information, but it hadn't been respected. Clarification mattered. It established rights, not just history. The officer noted it, ensuring future claims couldn't blur boundaries again. Ownership isn't just about property, it's about control and security. Knowing the home was unquestionably hers reinforced what evidence already showed. She had been targeted in her own space. That clarity closed a door manipulation had tried to open. With facts established and authority aligned, boundaries were enforced immediately. Expectations were stated clearly. Interactions would change. Access would be limited. Oversight would continue. She didn't argue or demand. She agreed calmly, relieved that structure had replaced uncertainty. Boundaries turned safety into policy. They removed ambiguity that manipulation thrives on. This wasn't about punishment, it was about prevention. With boundaries enforced, the situation could no longer escalate quietly. Protection didn't come from confrontation. It came from clarity backed by systems. And that clarity ensured this would never happen again. If you want to see how this situation finally resolves and what changes next, stay with the story and subscribe, because the outcome shifts everything that follows. With the reports finalized, legal protection followed quickly. Restraining provisions were discussed, documentation filed, and procedures explained clearly. For the first time in months, she felt shielded by structure instead of suspicion. Protection didn't feel dramatic, it felt grounding. Knowing there was now an official record meant future accusations would not exist in a vacuum. False claims had consequences, and that understanding mattered. Legal protection didn't erase what had happened, but it prevented it from happening again. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and signed nothing she didn't fully understand. This time she moved slowly and deliberately. Safety wasn't just emotional anymore, it was formal, enforceable, and real. That alone changed everything. Living arrangements were adjusted without argument. Space was redefined, access restricted, routines separated. The changes weren't emotional, they were practical. Children were reassured, schedules clarified, boundaries respected. The house felt different almost immediately. Quieter, safer. She no longer felt watched or evaluated. Adjusting living arrangements wasn't about punishment, it was about restoring balance. Everyone knew where they stood, ambiguity was removed. For the first time in a long while, she could move freely in her own home without tension following her. The physical separation mirrored an emotional one that had already occurred. Distance didn't weaken the household, it stabilized it. And stability was exactly what had been missing. Whispers don't survive documentation. As the truth spread quietly through proper channels, assumptions corrected themselves. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact began greeting her again. Professionals treated her with respect, not caution. No announcements were made, but the shift was visible. Reputation isn't restored through explanation, it's restored through clarity. She didn't defend herself or demand apologies. She let facts stand. Over time, the narrative that painted her as unstable dissolved completely. What replaced it was something steadier, credibility. Knowing her name was no longer questioned allowed her to breathe easier. Reputation mattered not for pride, but for dignity. And that dignity had been fully restored. Independence returned quietly, without fanfare. She made her own decisions again, about her schedule, her space, her future. No one monitored her movements or questioned her memory. That freedom felt unfamiliar at first, then empowering. Independence wasn't about isolation. It was about autonomy. She reclaimed control over daily life, finances, and boundaries. Each decision reinforced that she was capable, clear-minded, and fully present. What had been challenged publicly was now affirmed privately. Reclaiming independence meant trusting herself again, without needing validation. That trust became the foundation for everything that followed. Power dynamics within the family shifted permanently. Authority no longer came from manipulation or fear, it came from truth and structure. Decisions were made transparently. Conversations became direct. The imbalance that once allowed control to grow was gone. Power reset didn't mean dominance, it meant fairness. She was no longer treated as someone to manage or dismiss. Her voice carried equal weight again. That reset changed interactions immediately. Respect replaced tension. Clarity replaced strategy. The family didn't become closer, but it became honest. And honesty was far healthier than forced harmony. There were no emotional reunions or dramatic apologies. Peace arrived without reconciliation. She didn't need closure conversations or explanations. What she needed was distance and consistency. Peace came from knowing boundaries would be honored, from knowing systems were in place, from knowing she was no longer vulnerable to manipulation. Forgiveness wasn't required for peace. Acceptance was. She accepted what had happened and chose not to reopen it. That choice freed her from reliving the conflict. Peace, she learned, doesn't always come from healing relationships. Sometimes it comes from ending their influence. The silence that once protected lies was gone. In its place stood documented truth. No one could quietly rewrite events anymore. What happened was known, recorded, and resolved. Silence now meant something different. It meant stability. She no longer feared what might be said behind closed doors. There was nothing left to hide. Ending silence didn't require confrontation. It required evidence, patience, and resolve. With everything settled, she returned to her routines calmly. Life didn't restart, it normalized. And in that normalcy, she found something powerful: safety built on truth, not fear.